Welcome to the first of the Spring 2011 lecture series by the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences here at Stony Brook, Southampton. I'm Chris Gobler. I'm the Director of Academic Programs for SoMAS here in Southampton. And we're glad you made it here on this cool evening. Hopefully each first Friday we get together from here on out will be nicer and nicer. This is the first of 4 lectures we're doing this spring. We'll be going through June. I'll introduce our speaker momentarily. Next month, I'll be actually speaking. Brad Peterson's group will be here as well. And that'll be the Stony Brook Southampton Coastal and Estuarine Research Program. We'll have lots of student posters and presentations along with that. In May, the first Friday in May, will be Bill Wise talking about the Menhaden fishery and the history of that in New York. And then finally, Jackie Collier will be here in June to talk about using DNA and genomes and genomics to understand marine ecosystems. If you've been following the news, it's been an exciting week for SoMAS here at Stony Brook, Southampton. Perhaps you saw there was the announcement this week that starting next fall we'll be resuming having on-campus undergraduates in the dorms enrolled in academic programs here. Specifically, we'll be starting a new program called Semester by the Sea, and I won't go into the details of it, but we will have students in residence here as undergraduates once again. And which, yes, we're very excited about it. I will mention, of course, that we, unlike most of the rest of the campus, we haven't gone away. I mean, that is, some of the faculty are still here all the time. Well, I should say not all the time. Some of the faculty are here during the week. Some graduate students are here all of the time. And the Marine Station is still quite active. And in fact, we're hoping in a short period of time to be breaking ground on a new Marine Station. And perhaps before this lecture series ends, I'll have a final report and positive news on that. But getting to the activities of the evening, tonight's speaker is Dr. Jeff Levinton. Dr. Levinton, and maybe you read about his research here, or this lecture here. It's in that you can get a copy of this actually. There's a nice write-up in the Sag Harbor Express about both some of the work that Jeff does as well as some local work that's being done with oysters. But as a brief bio for Dr. Levinton, and it's a very, very long biography. I downloaded his CV and many pages to go through, but it all started at City College where he got a Bachelor of Science degree. He did both his Master's and PhD at Yale University. He's now a distinguished professor within the Department of Ecology and Evolution, but he also has a joint appointment with the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. He has over 150 peer-reviewed publications. And when you hear the term, he wrote, or they wrote the book on it, or he wrote the book on it, Jeff wrote the book on it. He's got the book that's called Marine Ecology, the book that's called Marine Biology, which we were discussing earlier. It's now in its 3rd edition and been doing quite well. He's an expert on lots of different things, mainly on the bottom of marine ecosystems. He also has books on, I said marine biology, marine ecology, a great book that came out recently on the Hudson River estuary. He's won multiple teaching awards at Stony Brook, so he's also, beyond being a great scientist, he's also a good speaker. So we're excited to hear his talk tonight, which is about restoring oysters to New York waters, dream or reality. Jeff. Okay.
So good evening, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here to talk to you a little bit about some thinking about oysters and about restoring oysters. And I'm going to start my story in Australia. I met a fellow, I'll just say his name is Dave, that's good enough for us for the moment, and he was in a boat coming alongside of a boat I was on, and we started talking. And you can see that he's got some stuff in his boat. Turns out it's filled with things called French sticks. Sounds a little racy, but they're these posts that are put in the bottom to attract oyster larvae. And we started talking. He had a big smile on his face, and that's because he had a really big oyster farm that was bringing him large amounts of income with the famous Sydney Rock oyster, the self-affirmed world's best oyster. Any Australian will tell you it's the best oyster on the planet. Maybe they're wrong, but they're pretty darn good. I can personally attest to that. And we talked for a few minutes, and he was telling us what he was doing with these French sticks and so on. And then he said, I've been recently reading this book. He knew I was from New York, and he said, I read this book by this guy, and it says that you once had just enormous amounts of oysters in New York, and you killed them all, and they're all gone. And he had a big smile on his face, like, what had we done wrong when there are oysters all along the east coast of Australia, in oyster farms, by the way. And if you go back in history, you find both paintings and pen and ink drawings that tell you a story of how oysters were a part of the culture of New York, certainly Long Island, absolutely New York City, where among them, Kurlansky, I think, goes a little bit overboard by saying that it was the largest oyster grounds on the East Coast. That's very unlikely. I would say Chesapeake Bay wins that hands down, but pretty big, and continuously from Staten Island all the way up to Sing Sing, New York, which is no longer called Sing Sing because they got embarrassed when the prison was named Sing Sing, so they renamed their town Ossining, New York. So there's really broad amounts of oysters all over the place, and they were part of the culture. And the interesting thing, and Kurlansky makes this point in his book, that oysters were a food, and maybe a unique food, that was eaten by rich and poor alike. That isn't a very original point, by the way, because you can find that quote in the 19th century of an individual who'd come to Baltimore who said exactly the same thing, only he said something even cleverer. He said that something like, the poor people eat their oysters with ale and the rich eat it with champagne. But the point is made that oysters are one of those foods that through several hundred years has been a delectable item for everybody, rich and poor alike. Not true of almost anything else. Either the rich don't want to eat them, like lobsters they didn't want to eat, or the poor can't afford beef. So oysters really have this wonderful, unique situation. And if we go back to the time, this is not a photograph of Staten Island in 1750. We don't have a photograph for then. But we do know from accounts that there were enormous oyster beds around the periphery of Staten Island, especially in the Kilvan Cull and the Arthur Kill. Almost unimaginable today that this would be so. And Staten Island has seen its hard knocks over time. Doesn't quite look the same as it must have in those days. We have a really different type of vista. So we have an interesting situation. We have an organism that once was dominant, preeminent, and is essentially gone. I'm not going to go through a lot of the history of that. I encourage you to read Mark Kurlansky's book. It has a couple of errors in it, but it's really a wonderful read, and it gives you a wonderful idea of where oysters were mostly present and the impact they had on the culture of mainly New York City. And I want to go back to Australia and say, are Australian oyster reefs any better? Was this fellow Dave, did he have a right to laugh? Not really, because in Australia, there used to be prolific oyster beds along the entire east coast of Australia and also along the south coast. They're pretty much 100% gone. What's left is a very, very profitable oyster farming culture and a whole group of people that farm oysters. And by the way, if you're interested in this, there's a movie called Oyster Farmer you could get off Netflix. It's an Australian movie. It's kind of a cool movie. It's rated R. You got to watch out. And it comes late, the R. But the R part for the oysters, it comes very early in the movie. They spawn, and you see it. But unfortunately for one's family thinking about watching the movie, there's a human spawning event later on. So I warn you about it, but it's really quite a good movie, okay? So So we have a number of current problems. The list is daunting. And all of these, over time, I'm not going to go through the history, have contributed to the demise of oysters in our region. Not the elimination of them, and there are places where oysters are still rather prolific in our area. As we go toward New York, that just isn't really so on the South Shore. Of course, habitat destruction, our shorelines have been altered. Think about Manhattan Island, where there were so many oysters, or Staten Island, you get the idea. Overfishing. By 1800, the oysters in New York were pretty much gone on the natural oyster mounds. That far ago. It's really remarkable. Chesapeake Bay, they had abundant oysters on oyster mounds much more recently, well into the 20th century. But in New York, by 1812, most of the oysters that were taken were seed that were brought from other places, sometimes Chesapeake Bay. Some of you may know that the very famous Blue Point oyster, of which all of us Long Islanders are proud, is not a native oyster. It was brought by a person. A whole bunch of oysters were brought from Chesapeake Bay in a barge, dumped near Blue Point, and they took and they reproduced. So we have habitat destruction. We have overfishing, which is old. We have pollution, which is a little bit newer. By the turn of the 20th century, New York City waters were really a problem. Some of you also may know that oysters, regrettably, carried typhoid. And it started occurring reasonably abundantly and frequently toward the end of the 19th century, down at Chesapeake Bay and also in New York waters. Of course, down at Chesapeake Bay, they blamed New York. And New York, they blamed Chesapeake Bay, but there was typhoid, and that certainly put a damper on oyster consumption in many places, and places were beginning to be closed down. There also are oyster diseases. I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving you the details of them, but they are extremely crucial in the question of whether we can restore oysters. The food supply has been altered. Those of you who have been exposed to the story of scallops on Long Island, the stories of brown tides, know that the type of food supply in the water has varied a lot. The oysters had a special problem relating to the duck farms that was kind of the coup de grace for oysters in Great South Bay. The duck farms had a certain type of nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, and that stimulated the growth of algae that were not good for oysters. So food supply is a problem. And as the oysters have become very rare, the same problem has arose that has arisen for other types of shellfish in New York waters, most particularly the hard clam, but in the West Coast, very famously, several species of abalone, where there are so few, so dispersed over such great distance, that a male will spawn here, a female will spawn a kilometer away, and that's all that's left. You're not going to get very much of a next generation. So they're limited by the small numbers of gametes in the water and recruits. So all these are the problems. Every one of them alone is a very difficult problem indeed. And there are future problems. I hate to get you so bummed out so quickly, but one needs to be aware of what the difficulties are, and they are climate change problems. Some of them are probably happening now. Some are happening now. We know that in the last 30 years, there's been an acceleration in this region of sea surface temperature. There's been an uptick since about the 60s. We don't have the best records in the world of sea surface temperature in inshore waters, as anybody in the room who has ever looked for them knows. There aren't numbers, but there's pretty good records in Woods Hole, and we know that there's been a big change recently. We also have a climate change problem. But it's not very well defined. But many people have predicted increased rainfall. I'm going to get back to that. There's Dr. Gobler. He could tell you about a problem that maybe is already happening, but is certainly going to get worse, and that's ocean acidification. Often people say the other carbon dioxide problem, the dissolution of carbon dioxide into seawater, that is acidifying the ocean. Mostly it's at a very low rate. There's a lot of variation right inshore, so it often falls in the background noise of the variation of pH, but nevertheless is a problem. And there are certain parts of the world, most notably the Pacific Northwest, where for reasons that are not too well understood, the pH is plummeting. and there's already noticeable changes and reorganizations of the biota based on whether they have calcium carbonate or not in the intertidal zone. So there are some problems ahead from climate change. Is it bad everywhere? No. If we go into Jamaica Bay, it's horrible. You can't find a live oyster except the ones that I've put there in cages. There just aren't any live oysters there. You look at New York Harbor, when somebody finds an oyster that has settled on the rock in New York Harbor, they send an email to a group of us, about 30 or 40 strong, and we all just get so excited that an oyster has been found, and some of us go like to Red Hook and Brooklyn to see them. That's how rare they are. There are a few around in various places in the New York Harbor area, but they're quite rare. Long Island Sound, there's bunches of them. I got took to a place by Flax Pond, which is very near Stony Brook, just a few days ago, and there were live oysters that were brought up by a storm in a windrow on the beach. Pretty exciting. I want to go there and go snorkeling pretty soon. Long Island Sound still has active oyster farms, but also oyster beds, like in Oyster Bay, for example, and also some natural oyster mounds that are being exploited. Although mostly they tend to be things that are seeded. That is, you put juveniles and you grow them up. But there are a lot of other places. Great South Bay, I asked Dr. Bob Serrato recently whether he had seen an oyster in Great South Bay outside of a cage, and no. Big place, Great South Bay. Once the place where the blue point oyster was, there's a long demise there, partially due to predators, partially due to bad food, partially due to ultimately to reorganization from salinity, a hurricane, all these things. There's nothing there anymore. It's amazing. It is amazing. And there's no excuse for this. We've overexploited them, polluted them, stepped on them, eaten them, poisoned them, allowed the world to get hot. We're doing it to them. And there are some places where there's still a lot of oysters left, but they're going fast. Chesapeake Bay is a 1% of the level, that is, the harvest is 1% of the level it was in 1870. So that's pretty impressive. So now I want to just quickly, I'm kind of giving the upfront talk, and then I'm going to go step back. And I know that all of you aren't oyster maniacs and also biologists, and I want to give you some introduction to what oysters are all about. But I thought I'd get to the stuff about restoration first. And so the first thing is, what are the options to restore oysters? And there are a few. The first one is the naturalist type of option, and that is to think about the way oysters were in a place like Chesapeake Bay, along the shores of Staten Island, all the way up the Hudson River, all the way into Tappan Zee, in parts of Long Island Sound, but not all of Long Island Sound, where there were large mounds. And the dream, and the dream would be to bring these mounds back, have them be places where larvae settle, where lots of fish get attracted, where the biodiversity is enhanced, because we know that oyster reefs are real foci for biodiversity. One reason we would like to have them there. That's the first option. The second option is something similar, but not depending upon natural settling of oyster larvae. I'm going to get back to talking about them in a little bit. And that's to have oysters mounds that are continuously replenished year after year by reseeding. And this has been done since the beginning of the 19th century in the Hudson-Raritan areas, done in Connecticut, done in a lot of places. If we had 3 hours, and I know you're really grateful you don't have 3 hours with me, but if we had 3 hours, I'd tell you this long history about this argument about natural beds versus suboptimal beds where oysters would be allowed to be planted as seed. That's an old story that guides oyster management both here and New Jersey and Chesapeake Bay. It's a parallel story, but the enforcement and the politics are very different in all the different places. And if you're interested in that, you should see a book or read a book by Kiner called The Oyster Problem. And if you're a little impatient about reading a book, she's going to be here not here, in Stony Brook University next Thursday at 4:30, talking with another individual whose name I can't remember, I'm sorry, but they're going to talk about management. And she wrote a really wonderful book that talks about the oyster problem in Chesapeake Bay. And it takes a long time to explain it, but it's fascinating because of the politics and so on. So the third way so you can have these mounds and you reseed them. The third way is not oyster natural environment at all. It's oyster aquaculture. You put cages on the bottom, you put oysters in them, you grow them up. After a certain amount of time, you remove them and you sell them. That's obviously an option for oystermen, people, watermen, people who would be able to sell oysters and get them for food. You might think it's an option they would love to have, but there's decades and decades and decades of history of many people who've resisted that option. They don't like it, and there's all sorts of very fascinating reasons why that might be so, but that's the way it is. More and more on Long Island, there are leases being given by the DEC, recently ones in Peconic Bay, other leases that have been given and are about to be given in Great South Bay, and for oysters to grow. So this third option, is it a natural option? Not really. Do these cages do other things like the first two options? Do they enhance biodiversity? A little bit. They attract fish. Things settle on the cages, which is pretty annoying. They want to scrape them off, but they still grow. So these are the options. And here's in red is my assessment of what we've got ahead of us for these three options. Long shot, but if you keep on seeding them, maybe you would have a good year and you have larval sets and you might get expansion of a population. And then, of course, oyster aquaculture is workable because we know that oysters can be grown almost anywhere in Long Island and in New York waters. And you'll see I have some evidence for that in a little bit. Okay, so can we get restoration work to happen? I've already mentioned that one of the problems is that when the oyster population gets really low, and in Jamaica Bay it is low in a theatrical way, as I said, you try and find one. I'll give you some money if you find one for me. I've been looking. The only ones I've found are ones that I'm almost certain come from spawning on our own oyster cages. That's a problem, just recruitment limitation. The second problem, which was pointed out by Eric Powell and Roger Mann in a very, very aggressive, nasty, depressing paper published a few years ago, saying something like oyster restoration is impossible and hopeless and don't even try it, and try to submit a paper to the contrary. That's the theme of the paper. It's pretty nasty, and one of the authors in person is even nastier. And their argument is very simple but very compelling, and that is that once you get to the point that these oyster mounds are very down low and nearly gone, the shell dissolution rate and the breakdown rate is so fast that the oysters don't recruit fast enough to build up these mounds, and you need a high mound up in the water column for oysters to grow rapidly. So you have this negative spiral out of control and the oyster beds disappear. It doesn't help that some of the oyster exploitation is with dredges, and these dredges just take the tops off these mounds, for example, in Chesapeake Bay. That's one of the reasons why people in Chesapeake Bay were frightened of dredging. It made them prohibit power boats, even well into the 19th century, in the beginnings of the 19th century, when they had steamboats. They made them illegal right away because they knew that dredging would destroy the oyster beds right away. So they made them use these wonderfully just lovely, beautiful skipjack boats that maybe many of you have seen pictures of. Maybe some of you have seen them. Maybe a few of you have even gone to sail on them because most of them are out of service for oystering now because there's hardly any oysters left. Maybe you could put down shell in some places and do restoration, and that has been proven to be the case in Chesapeake Bay, where there still are, even though it's only 1%, there's a lot of oysters there. Oysters spawn a lot of gametes and they make a lot of larvae, and there's still a lot of recruitment. So recently, a group working with the Corps of Engineers made a successful oyster restoration in just the place where Mann and Powell said it can't be done. And they absolutely did it. It was published in Science. Almost everybody but Mann and Powell admit that it was a successful restoration. But that's a place that is Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay is like that too, where there's lots of larvae in the water and there's lots of recruitment. We don't have that luxury in a lot of New York waters. Certainly not New York Harbor, certainly not Jamaica Bay, and not Great South Bay. But in Long Island Sound, we do have larvae settling. In fact, there have been pretty good sets right by my little home creek of West Meadow Creek the last 3 or 4 years. There have been a fair number of oysters coming down, lots of mussels coming down. So these sets are often episodic, but a lot of the South Shore, especially west of here, not very good.